In late 1989, the Doctor and Ace walked off our screens arm in arm, stating that they still had work to do. Sadly, the BBC had other plans, and their work in 1990 consisted of hosting a spoof quiz show for the BBC's school's output. If you wanted a fix of Doctor Who, you had to pick up a VHS, a Target novel, or slip sideways in time to an alternative 1990 where, thanks to a last-minute decision by the executives, the show was given one last chance, and season 27 formed a central part of the autumn lineup. For those who didn't have access to such technology, though, you could always wait until 2011 when, as part of their Lost range, Big Finish put out a series of 4 stories under a season 27 banner. If you're not familiar with the Lost range, it takes stories that didn't quite make it to the screen for one reason or another and, with suitable adjustments for audio, gives them a second chance at life. With this in mind, in this first episode of Doctor Who Lost and Found, we're heading back to 2011 to visit 1990's take on 1967. Though, as we're about to discover, this whole range is about to find itself treading on very thin ice. Before we begin, let's go through a few ground rules. Normally, I'm pretty happy when Big Finish decides to get creative with different eras of Doctor Who. After all, it's what the show relied on in the real 1990s when it found itself as a novel franchise rather than a TV series. For me, however, the Lost range is different. It's claiming to be a representation of scripts or stories that were very much intended for broadcast on television in a specific year, or at the very least, era. Naturally, the scripts will have had to have been adapted for the audio medium, so won't be 100% as they would have been on television, and this might require them to be marginally longer than they would have been to accommodate some extra dialogue, that sort of thing. However, it should be relatively easy to see how they would have been achieved on the BBC budget of the day, using BBC technology of the day, and theoretically appealing to the audience of the day. Season 27 would definitely have seen the show on its final chance, so hopefully we'll find evidence of pulling the stops out to impress. Of course, there's no knowledge of who would have been behind the scenes. JNT had said, "This is my last season," how many times by this stage? And all of the casting, music, direction, etc. would have been wildly different 35 years ago or so. I'll try and restrict my comments, both good and bad, to the scripts and ideas rather than any specific performances, which might be just as well for one of the stories in the season. And let's be kind. Let's actually assume that the BBC are on the side of the show and are willing to give it some publicity, as the first story in the season does at least have the decency to have a hook to draw the viewers in. It's Saturday tea time, and the Ice Warriors are back. So, a quick overview. Thin Ice is about the Russians trying to get their hands on Ice Warrior technology, the Ice Warriors trying to revive one of their ancient warriors, and the Doctor and Ace trying not to get caught in the crossfire, whilst the Doctor also tries to pull some strings to get Ace into the Academy on Gallifrey. On paper, it should work pretty well. You've got the pull of the Ice Warriors, giving the show in general some nice publicity for the new season. You've got a location that hasn't been done before, Russia, and you've potentially got a nostalgia factor. It's set in the late 1960s, so just over 20 years before broadcast date, and easily in the memory of a large chunk of the people who'd be watching. More interestingly, though, it's the start of a very different style of Doctor Who season. Unlike most of the previous 26 seasons, there are threads that will run through all 4 of the stories, and what we can't know for sure is how this would have been publicised. On one hand, it could work in the show's favour, potentially promising a bigger payoff than usual for watching absolutely every single episode. On the flip side, it also risks turning people away who still want the dip in and out style. These days, we are very used to season-long arcs, but in 1990, I think it would have been a big risk. Americans were only just at the end of the 3rd season of Star Trek The Next Generation, and the BBC had only just begun showing the first. Whatever the public's take on this new style of television, Thin Ice would really need to do something special from the word go to keep the viewers coming back for more, which is definitely not guaranteed. Part 1, at least, has the promise of Ice Warriors, and, as is traditional, we don't get the first full Ice Warrior until the end of the episode. What we get before that, though, is a lot of running around Russia, a mini motorbike chase sequence halfway through, and, okay, it's 1990, setting part of the episode in a fur-based fashion show might have resulted in the dads getting their kicks, but it's definitely more a dialogue-heavy opener than might have been wise. As much as I'd like to say that it becomes an all-out James Bond-style thriller in the other 3 parts, that would be a massive distortion of what is actually another 3 parts of talk, driving around in various cars and vans, and one not hugely thrilling break into a vault, which, as it turns out, is one of the running themes of the entire season. Yes, there are Ice Warriors, but they stand around a lot and hiss when they talk. However, the Big Finish episodes are between 5 and 10 minutes too long each time, and so hopefully a lot of the more talky bits might have ended up as more action bits, as well as ending up on the cutting room floor bits. On the plus side, though, for the BBC at least, this isn't exactly a story that screams expensive to make. With the exception of a few key scenes, it's going to be very easy location work. You've got a lot of side roads from Russia and London. There's a large chunk of the story set in a hotel. There are scenes in a living room. Virtually an entire episode set in the back of a van that's parked in the hold of a spaceship, aka a warehouse with a few sparkly cables laying around, if the BBC are at their usual level. And quite a lot of night shooting, which should disguise some of the more 1990 bits of the South Bank and allow it to pass off as 1967. A few glass shots, or even shock horror some computer-added bits, would give a more Russian skyline when needed, and all the telepathic stuff with the Doctor and the Time Lords could easily be done with an effect similar to the one seen in Greatest Show in the Galaxy Episode 4, or, as will be suggested elsewhere, simply set in a different location, possibly a boardroom, as hinted at in other pieces about the season. It wouldn't need an audio effect to show that it was telepathic. In fact, the Doctor suddenly doing scenes in a boardroom when he should be in Russia could be a more subtle way of doing things until the big reveal that it's the Time Lords. We know from Silver Nemesis that putting a spaceship onto the screen isn't going to be a challenge, and with no trees in the landing area, no need to borrow a helicopter to create wind. And getting period-accurate vehicles to drive around in probably wouldn't be a challenge. A more unusual obstacle does crop up in Part 2, however. There are scenes set during the anniversary parade for the October Revolution, and characters proudly showing off their missiles. No, not a euphemism. Admittedly, the usual workaround for this is to have the characters shown facing the camera in the viewing area, thus getting around the need to see the parade in detail itself. Unfortunately, the climax of the episode does also require the Doctor and company to end up using the parade as a way to get away from the Russians, and so some footage would probably be needed. A quick glimpse at YouTube offers 2 interesting possibilities. Pathé News covered the parade, and so there is high-quality authentic footage out there. But it's in black and white. How easily this could have been coloured to broadcast standard in 1990 is questionable, but it would be an option to allow just a couple of seconds of footage to be dropped in here and there to add an authentic look. The second option, also found on YouTube, but I don't know when the footage surfaced, is that there is genuine colour footage from the parade, but on YouTube at least, it looks pretty ropey quality. Again, it's not impossible that 1990 could have tidied the footage up, so with one or both of these options, a dozen extras in uniform goose-stepping past the camera, and a big red 1917 banner hung from a building somewhere, that should just about do it. I'm also guessing that putting together a shot or 2 of a police box sitting on a frozen river could be done fairly easily, probably a model shot. And the overrunning episode 4 can definitely ditch its Big Finish plugging of Red Dawn. I suspect that the biggest outlay for the story is going to be on the Ice Warriors themselves. In a weird quirk of fate, Thin Ice is the second Ice Warrior story in the Lost Range, So it depends very much on just what got shown in this alternate timeline for Season 23 as to what exists in what state for Ice Warrior costumes. Realistically, though, we should assume that, especially for publicity purposes, a whole new batch of Ice Warrior costumes would have been made for this story, as that would allow for a decent Ice Warrior contingent to be seen on screen without having to do either split screen or lots of cutaways to Ice Warrior groups standing to try and fake an army. It would also definitely have given lots of photo opportunities, lots of potential for highly accurate Daypol figures. Hey, it's an alternate timeline. And the chance to then see the costumes up close somewhere like Longleat. Personally, though, I just couldn't get enthusiastic about the story. It really needs a lot of trimming and cutting to get it to 25 minutes per episode, but hopefully that might give it some desperately needed pace. There is, though, the promise of continuity, and the BBC would undoubtedly have made a big fuss of the fact that some of the characters would be coming back in the next story. There isn't actually anything wrong with Thin Ice. It's just slightly on the slow side, and things would need to speed up as the weeks progressed to keep some of the viewers happy. That, though, is for the second part of Lost and Found. And in that, we'll find out what Big Finish, or the BBC, thought they were able to pull off.